Data analytics, Excel data analysis, and for this video, we'll be discussing about data validation. Introduction. Data validation is a very useful and easy to use tool in Excel with which you can set data validations on the data that is entered into your worksheet. For any cell on the worksheet, you can display an input message on what needs to be entered into it, restrict the values that get entered, provide a list of values to choose from, and display an error message and reject an invalid data entry. So we can use this one to minimize errors of users, especially in entering data or entering values into your worksheet. Consider the following risk tracker that can be used to enter and track the identified risk. So in this tracker, the data that is entered into the following columns is validated with preset data constraints, and the entered data is accepted only when it meets the validation criteria. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So we have here the values: probability, impact, risk category, resource status. The column risk exposure will have calculated values. So this one. And you cannot enter any data. Even the column S number is set to have calculated values that are adjusted even if you delete a row. Now you will learn how to set up such a worksheet. So we're going to set up a worksheet similar to this one shown on this video. To prepare the structure of the worksheet, start with a blank worksheet. Put the header in row 2. So row 2. Put the column headers in row 3. So row 3, we have the column headers in row 3. For the column headers, probability, impact, and risk exposure. So probability, impact, and risk exposure. Right click on the cell. Click on Format Cells from drop down. In the Format Cells dialog box, click on Alignment tab and type 90 under Orientation. So you notice this is how they appear. Merge and center the cells in row 3, 4, and 5. So row 3, 4, and 5 for each of the column headers. Format borders for the cells in row 2 to 5. So row 2 to 5. So the borders. Adjust the row and column width. So your worksheet will look as follows. Set valid values for risk category. In the cells M5 to M13, enter the following values. M5 is heading and M6 to 13 are the values. So we have the category values. We have end users, customer, management, schedule, so maybe just one, environment, product, and project. So these are the values from M5 with the title and M6 to M7. So we have only one schedule here. Click the first cell under the column risk category, H6. So this is the first cell, H6. Click data on the ribbon and then click on data validation in the data tools group and then select data validation. So I repeat, so this is the category we entered in the previous screen. So click on the first cell under risk category, click data, then click data validation and then select data validation. The data validation dialog box appears. So this is the data validation dialog box. Click the settings tab under the validation criteria, in the allow drop down list, so this is the allow drop down list, select the option list. So select list. Select the range M16 to M13. So in the source, you can click on this and then select the source M6 to M13. And then check the box ignore blank and in cell drop down. Click the input message tab, input message tab. So this is the input message tab in the data validation dialog box. Check the box show input message. So show input message when cell is selected. In the box under title, type risk category, and in the box under input message, you type choose the category of the risk from the list. To set error alert for the risk category. So to set error alert, we click on the error alert tab in the data validation dialog box. Check the box show error alert after invalid data is entered. Select the stop under style drop down. So if you select stop, this will be the icon that will be used in displaying the error message. In the box under title, type invalid entry, and in the box under error message, type choose a value from drop down list, and then we click OK. Now to verify data validation for risk category, for the selected first cell under risk category, data validation criteria is set, input message is set, error alert is set. So we have done this a while ago. So now you can verify your settings. So click in the cell for which you have the set data validation criteria, so this one, and the input message appears. So once you click here, this is the input message. The drop down button appears. So this is the drop down button on the right side of the cell. Click on the drop down on the right side. So the drop down on the right side, and the drop down list appears with the values that can be selected. So these are the values that can be selected. So these values are from this range. Cross-check the values in the drop-down list with those that are used to create the drop-down list. Both the sets of values match. Note that if the number of values is more, you will get a scroll down bar. So a scroll down bar here on the right side of the drop-down list. Verify data validation. So select a value from the drop-down list. It appears in a cell. So here the user selected environment. You can see that the selection of valid values is working fine. So we have now verified the data validation for risk category. Finally, try to enter an invalid entry and verify the error alert. Type people in the cell and press enter key. So you type, instead of selecting, you type people. So error message that you have set for the cell will be displayed. So this is now the error message. Verify the error message. So that's correct. You have an option to either retry or cancel. Verify both the options. You have successfully set the data validation for the cell. So note, it is very important to check the spelling and grammar of your messages. Of course, that is to avoid confusion. Set valid criteria for the risk category column. So set the valid criteria for the risk category column. So now you are ready to apply the data validation criteria to all the cells in the risk category column. At this point, you need to remember two things. You need to set the criteria for maximum number of cells that are possible to be used. In our example, it can vary from 10 to 100 based on where the worksheet will be used. You should not set the criteria for unwanted range of cells or for the entire column. This will unnecessarily increase the file size. It is called excess formatting. If you get a worksheet from an outside source, you have to remove the excess formatting. Follow the steps given below. So, set the validation criteria for 10 cells under risk category. You can easily do this by clicking on the right bottom corner of the first cell. So this is the right bottom corner. Hold on to the plus symbol that appears and pull it down. So if there's a plus symbol here, then pull it down. Data validation now is set for all the selected cells. Click the last column that is selected and verify. So the data validation for the column risk category is complete. So you notice this one appeared, so that means that we already have placed the data validation for this cell. Now we have to set validation values for risk source. In this case, we have only two values, internal and external. So click the first cell under the column risk source, that is in I6. Then click the data tab on the ribbon, so just like what we have done previously. Then click data validation in the data tools group. Then select data validation from the drop down list. So after doing this, the data validation dialog box appears. Click the settings tab. So this is the settings tab. Under the validation criteria in allow drop down list, select option list. Again, we select option list. Then in the source, we just type external comma or internal comma external in the source box that appears. Check the boxes, ignore blank, and in cell drop down that appear. Set the input message for resource. So input message to check. So give the title and give the message. Then set the error alert for resource. So again, click on error alert, check, style, title, and then the message. For the selected first cell under risk source, data validation criteria is set, input message is set, and error alert is set. So we have set those three here in this cell. Now you can verify your settings. Click on the cell on which you have set data validation. So this is the cell. Input message appears. The drop down button appears on the right side of the cell. So the input message is displayed correctly. Now click on the drop down arrow on the right side of the cell. A drop down list appears with the values that can be selected. So we have internal and external. Check if the values are the same as you type. So yes, then both the sets of values match. Select a value from the drop down list. It appears in the cell. So both the sets of values match. Select a value from the drop down list. So it appears on the cell. So we already have done that. You can see that the selection of valid values is working fine. Finally, try to enter an invalid entry and verify the error alert. So try to enter an invalid entry. So let's say we type financial instead of internal or external. So this error message will appear. So you have successfully set data validation for the cell. Set a valid criteria for the resource column. So apply the data validation to cells I6 to I15 in the risk column, the same range as that of the risk category column. Now data validation is set for all the selected cells. Data validation for the column risk source is complete. Set validation values for status. Repeat the same steps as you use for setting validation values for risk source and set the list value as open and closed. Apply the data validation criteria to the cells K6 to K15 in the status column, that is same range as that of the risk category column. Data validation is set for all the selected cells. Data validation for the column status is also complete. Set data validation for probability. Risk probability score values are in the range 1 to 5, 1 being low and 5 being high. The value can be any integer between 1 and 5, both inclusive. Click the first cell under the column risk source I6. So that's I6, and then click the data tab on the ribbon, just like what we have done last time, and click data validation in the data tools group. Select data validation from the drop down list and the data validation dialog box appears. So just like what we have done in the previous 3 columns. So click the settings tab. Under validation criteria, allow drop down list. So this time around we select whole number. Select between under data, so whole number. So under data we select between, then type 1 for the minimum value and type 5 for the maximum value. Set the input message, so click input message, check, give the title, and then the input message score 1 to 5, 1 low, 5 high, so that it will be clear for the user. Then set the error alert for probability and click OK. So error alert, click show, stop, value out of range. Please enter a number between 1 and 5. Set validation rules or values for probability. For the selected first cell under probability, we have now set the data validation criteria, the input message, and the error alert. Now you can verify your settings. Click on the cell for which you have set data validation criteria. The input message appears. So this is the input message. In this case, there will be no drop-down button because the input values are set to be in a range and not from a list. So we could see here that the input message is correctly displayed. Enter an integer between 1 and 5. It appears in a cell. Selection of valid values is working fine. Finally, try to enter an invalid entry and verify the error message. So let's say we try to enter 6, and you notice that the error message now will appear. So you have successfully set the data validation for the cell. Set valid criteria for the probability column. Apply the data validation criteria to the cells E6 up to E15 in the probability column, the same range as the risk category column. Data validation is set for all the selected cells. Data validation for the column probability is now complete. Now it's time for us to set validation values for impact. To set the validation values for impact, repeat the same steps that you use for setting validation values under probability. So apply the data validation criteria to cells F6 to F15 in the impact column, the same range as the risk category column. Data validation is set for all the selected cells. Data validation for the column impact is complete. So the same as what we have done in probability. Set the column risk exposure with calculated values. The risk exposure is calculated as a product of risk probability and risk impact. So risk exposure equals probability times impact. Type E6, so equal to E6 times F6 in cell G6. Then press enter key. 0 will be displayed in the cell G6 and E6, and F6 are because E6 and G6 and E6 are empty. Copy the formula in the cells G6 to G15. So we copy the formula, and 0 will be displayed in the cells G6 to G15. As the risk exposure column is meant for calculated values, you should not allow data entry in that column. So select cells G6 to G15, right click, and in the drop down list that appears, select Format Cells. So right click, then Format Cells. The Format Cells dialog box appears. Click the Protection tab and check the option Locked. This is to ensure that the data entry is not allowed in those cells. However, this will come into effect only when the worksheet is protected, which you will do as the last step after the worksheet is ready. Click OK, and then shade the cells G6 to G15 to indicate they are calculated values. You can leave it to the user to fill in the S number column. However, if you format the S number values, the worksheet looks more presentable. In addition, it shows for how many rows the worksheet is formatted. So type equal to row minus 5, because these are the number of rows, so equal to row minus 5, so we subtracted this, and press enter key. One will appear in the cell in B6. Copy the formula in cells B6 to B15, and the values 1 to 10 will appear. Shade the cells in B6 to B15. You're almost done with our project. So hide column M, because that is where we place our list. In the data category values, format borders for cells B6 to K16. Right click on the Worksheet tab, select Protect Sheet from the menu. The Protect Sheet dialog box appears. Check on option Project Worksheet and Contents of Block Sheet. Or Protect Worksheet rather, and Contents of Block Cells. Password is case sensitive, so you can place password. Protected sheet cannot be recovered if password is forgotten. So remember that. It is a good practice to keep a list of worksheet names and passwords somewhere. Under Allow, all users of this worksheet to check the box, select Unlock Cells. You have protected the locked cells in the column Risk Exposure from data entry and kept the rest of the unlocked cells editable. So we now click OK. To confirm password dialog box appears. So confirm password, then you re-enter the password. Caution: if you lose or forget the password, it cannot be recovered. It is advisable to keep a list of passwords and their corresponding workbook and sheet names in safe place. Remember that passwords are case sensitive. So we now re-enter the password, then we just click OK. So your worksheet with data validation set for selected cells is now ready to use. And that ends the lecture for data validation.